8. The Bell Witch. One of the most well-known examples of Appalachian folklore is the story of the Bell Witch. During the early 19th century, the family of a farmer named John Bell Sr. was repeatedly attacked by an invisible entity at their property in Robertson County, Tennessee. The Bells lived along the Red River near the modern-day town of Adams, where they eventually came to own 328 acres of property. Strange things began happening in 1817 when Bell encountered a creature in his cornfield that he later described as having a rabbit's head and a dog's body. He said that he shot at the animal, but that it got away. Shortly after this first encounter, the family began hearing beating sounds on the outside of their log home. The noises became increasingly frequent and forceful sounding over the following several nights, and the family also began to hear the faint whispering of an elderly woman who became known as the Bell Witch. Meanwhile, the Bell children complained of hearing rats gnawing at their bedposts and having their bed covers and pillows ripped away by an unexplained presence. The youngest daughter, Betsy, was affected the worst. On numerous occasions, the spirit pulled her hair, slapped her, and otherwise physically assaulted her. Word of the haunting spread, even catching the attention of future President and then Major General Andrew Jackson, who visited the Bell's property. As he approached, his wagon abruptly stopped. His horses were mysteriously unable to continue pulling it. After being stuck for several minutes, Jackson proclaimed that it must be the Bell Witch. Many believe that the Bell Witch was the ghost of a former neighbor of the Bells named Kate Batts. Before Kate died, she swore vengeance on the Bells due to a property dispute between the two families. Rumors continue to swirl to this day about similar manifestations haunting the property. 7. The murders of Jeff Hood and Molly Laro. While hiking the 2,180-mile Appalachian Trail in September 1990, a young couple named Jeffrey Hood and Molly Laro spent the night at the Thelma Mark shelter on Cove Mountain near Perry, Pennsylvania. The next morning, the pair were found murdered inside the shelter. In what was later described as a gruesome case of overkill, Jeff Hood had been shot 3 times and Molly Laro had been viciously stabbed. Her hands were bound and the rope was also wrapped around her neck. Hood and Laro were known for being a wholesome, virtuous couple who were intent on making a difference in the world during their lifetimes. Sadly, they never got the chance because their lives were snuffed out 3 months into their Appalachian journey. 1 week after the brutal double homicide, authorities arrested a 38-year-old drifter named Paul David Cruz in connection with the crime. Cruz had a long history of mental illness, drug abuse, and threatening behavior, and he was charged with murder 4 years prior to killing Hood and Laro for the killing of a woman in Florida. He'd been on the run ever since and was finally caught during an intensive manhunt following the double murder along the Appalachian Trail. After deliberating for just 45 minutes, a jury convicted Cruz of Hood and Laro's murders. He was sentenced to 2 life terms without parole and died in prison from natural causes in 2022 at the age of 70. In the wake of the couple's tragic deaths, the Thelma Mark shelter was taken down and a new one was built nearby. 6. Brown Mountain Lights. Reports of ghastly lights near Brown Mountain in North Carolina date back to before the Civil War. But there was a noticeable spike in sightings around 1910, roughly the same time electrical lighting became widespread near Brown Mountain. The lights are still seen to this day, with most sightings being reported in Burke County, roughly 60 to 70 miles north of Asheville. From the very beginning, there were doubts that the lights were caused by any sort of supernatural phenomenon. One skeptic, U.S. Geological Survey scientist George R. Mansfield, was able to prove in 1922 that most of the lights could be attributed to trains, car headlights, and brush fires. The lights were studied by U.S. government personnel on at least 2 other occasions, as well as by private groups. But storytellers and believers alike have sought to keep the legend alive, and they've been largely successful in doing so. Thousands of people have claimed to see the lights, which were featured in an episode of The X-Files in 1999 and inspired the 2014 film Alien Abduction. But the legends surrounding the lights have changed over time, and they tend to reflect cultural trends in noticeable ways. While many people refuse to think that the lights couldn't possibly be the product of folklore, all signs point toward them being exactly that. 5. The murder of Ronald S. Sanchez Jr. In 2019, Iraq War veteran Ronald S. Sanchez Jr. set off along the Appalachian Trail in search of peace. His mission was interrupted after reaching Southwest Virginia in May of that year, when he was fatally stabbed by a 30-year-old mentally unstable hiker from Massachusetts named James L. Jordan. After receiving an emergency GPS signal, police encountered a dog along the Appalachian Trail. The pup led them to Jordan, who admitted to killing Sanchez and severely wounding the victim's hiking companion with a 20-inch knife. Authorities charged Jordan with murder. Meanwhile, word of the unprovoked act of violence spread throughout the close-knit hiking community. It was one of the worst attacks to occur along the Appalachian Trail in decades, and the 10th murder in the 45 years that officials have been keeping records. And while hikers were left shaken and alarmed, most vowed not to let the incident stop them from starting or finishing their journey along the trail. During Jordan's trial, an expert witness for the prosecution testified that the defendant suffered from a severe psychiatric illness that features psychosis and mood disorder. The judge overseeing the case found Jordan not guilty by reason of insanity and ordered for him to be committed to a psychiatric institution, where he'll remain until or unless he's deemed to no longer be a substantial threat to society. Furthermore, the judge concluded that Jordan lacked the ability to differentiate between right and wrong when he committed the horrific stabbing, and that he didn't appreciate the wrongfulness of his actions. Through his attorney, Jordan apologized and expressed deep remorse for the profound sorrow he caused. Do you think you'll go hiking anytime soon after watching this video? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 4. Appalachian serial killer Robert Mountford Jr. and Laura Susan Ramsey were brutally murdered in 1981 while hiking the Appalachian Trail. The suspect, Randall Lee Smith, pleaded guilty to 2 charges of second-degree murder. In doing so, he avoided a trial and was therefore spared from having the gruesome details of the double homicide as well as his motive revealed to the public. Smith received a 30-year prison sentence but was paroled in 1996 after serving 15 years. The victims' families and the hiking community were outraged by his release, but their protests failed to stop Smith from being freed. Lo and behold, Smith struck again in 2008, 2 years after his parole ended. Less than 2 miles from where he killed Mountford and Ramsey, he befriended 2 fishermen. They kindly shared their dinner of trout and beans with Smith, who thanked them by pulling a gun without warning and firing 2 bullets into each victim. Thankfully, both men survived. Smith stole the victim's truck and attempted to escape, but he crashed the vehicle and was arrested the following day. In the meantime, the fishermen identified him as their attacker based on a missing persons poster featuring his photograph. The 54-year-old was charged with 2 counts of attempted capital murder, grand larceny, and possession of a firearm as a convicted felon. He was unfortunately never brought to justice. Just 4 days after committing the heinous act, Smith died in jail from injuries he sustained when he crashed the stolen truck. The outcome of the situation left the community reeling as they struggled to understand Smith's bizarre behavior. Although he had a history of disagreements with his neighbors, he had no established pattern of violence leading up to his first violent crimes. Smith's motives for committing such horrific acts of violence remain unclear to this day. 3. Wild Man of the Woods. While traveling through Caldwell County, North Carolina's Globe Valley in 1877, a party of gold miners encountered what they would later describe as a wild man. The group said that they came within 40 yards of the so-called peculiar specimen of humanity, which they described as gigantic in form, standing at a height of at least 6 feet 5 inches. They said that the creature had a funnel-shaped head and that his entire body was covered in thick 2-inch long fur. The miners further claimed that once the wild man spotted them, he pounded his chest and then ran off into the forest with astonishing speed. While attempting to track the creature, the mining party found a cave deep in the mountains. It was filled with animal bones, indicating that the wild man had lived there for quite some time. This is just one of hundreds of reported wild man sightings throughout the region following the Civil War. There were different versions of the creature, as well as stories of feral humans known as the Wild Men of the Mountains. And while some people who live in the Appalachian region certainly abide by a more isolated lifestyle than most, there's no concrete evidence of either a hominid-like being or a population of wild humans. 2. The murder of Rebecca White. While camping in Pennsylvania's Michoud State Forest during their hike along the Appalachian Trail in 1988, 29-year-old Rebecca White was approached by a man later identified as 22-year-old Stephen Roy Carr. He asked the woman for a cigarette and she said she didn't have one. White rushed over to her tent and told her partner, Claudia Brenner, that someone was near their campsite. The women decided to look for a more private campsite, but they ran into Carr again later that day while looking at their map. They continued along the trail and eventually decided upon a new campsite. Little did the couple know that Carr still had his eye on them, and he was watching them during a very private moment after dinner. While spying on the couple from 82 feet away, Carr fired his shotgun 8 times, hitting Brenner 5 times in the arm, face, head, and neck, and striking White twice in the head and back. Carr was under the impression that he'd killed both victims, but Brenner was still alive. Despite her injuries, she managed to walk 4 miles to the nearest road, where she hitched a ride to a police station. For the next 10 days, Carr hid in a Mennonite community, where residents typically didn't read the news or watch TV, and were therefore unaware that he was wanted for White's murder and for the attempted murder of Brenner. But his cover was blown when one of the members of the community watched the news and realized he was a fugitive. Authorities initially arrested Carr on a grand larceny warrant out of Florida. Once he was in custody, prosecutors pressed additional charges for the deadly shooting. At the time of the double homicide, he was living in a cave. Carr waived his right to a jury trial in exchange for getting the death penalty dropped. During his trial, he explained that he was enraged by the sight of 2 women being intimate with one another. He also claimed that the victims provoked him by being intimate with one another in front of him, although it's unlikely that they even knew that they were being watched. Carr's defense attorney pointed towards the accused killer's traumatic childhood and his history of being rejected by women as mitigating factors for his crime, but the judge was unmoved. The defendant ended up taking a plea deal and admitting to first-degree murder in exchange for a life sentence without parole. Brenner went on to write a book about her experience and became a vocal advocate against anti-gay violence. 1. The unsolved double murder of Julie Williams and Lolly Winans. During the summer of 1996, 26-year-old Laura Lolly Winans and 24-year-old Julianne Julie Williams went hiking near the Appalachian Trail in Shenandoah National Park in Virginia. The couple's plan was to get some R&R before Julie started a new job in Vermont. They were last seen alive on May 24th, and their families reported their missing 6 days later. The next day, the women's murdered bodies were found at their campsite. Laura was in the couple's tent, and Julie was about 40 feet away on an embankment in her sleeping bag. Both women were gagged, with their hands bound and their throats cut. The couple's golden retriever Taj was found wandering nearby. Investigators have identified suspects over the years, but the horrific double murder remains unsolved. One of the prime suspects was a man named Darrell David Rice. In 2002, prosecutors charged Rice with Winans and Williams murders, claiming that the crime was the product of his homophobic and sexist rage. Rice denied any involvement in the double homicide, and authorities failed to connect him to any forensic evidence found at the crime scene, even though a witness claimed to see him in the area around the time the women were killed. The charges were ultimately dropped due to a lack of evidence. Police also suspected a man named Richard Evonitz of murdering Winans and Williams. But he died shortly before he was about to be charged in connection with 3 other homicides, and he took any secrets he may have been carrying to the grave. It's unclear whether he's been tied to any evidence from the crime scene, but for all intents and purposes, the identity of the women's killer remains unknown to this day. Thanks for watching. Have you heard of any of these dark secrets of the Appalachian Trail before watching this video? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it.